World War V, also known as the War of the Elites, has broken out in Adis' Pro's What If Civilization Started Over series, and in today's video, I'm going to be simulating my prediction on it. Now, first of all, you might be looking at the map and being like, why does it look like half of the war's already happened? And that is because I recorded a whole first part of this, then I spent like 3 hours editing it, so it took me like 5 hours to make a video, and then I messed up the video at the very end, and I couldn't revert it. So that video is basically just lost to time. So that video is never going to end up being released, but I will do a quick recap. So I do apologize, and I know that does take away some of like the immersiveness of the scenario. But also, I do want to say that everyone has different ideas on how this is going to go. This is just my idea. But I would like to hear some of your ideas in the comments. And also, my scenario will not be revolving around any secret lore that Adis has, because I don't know that, I'm not him. And also, I may mention the two men that are meant to be behind this, like the elites, because it is called the War of the Elites. But I don't know how much I'm going to be mentioning that. And I'm mainly going to be focusing on a war between the red and the blue side, or China versus America, which you can see is what is happening right now on your screen. But nonetheless, let me go ahead and go through this map. First of all, in the Americas, we can see that America and East Mexico are absolutely slapping West Mexico and California. These three countries up here are neutral. Down here, Central America joined the war after pressure from Brazil and China, mainly because Central America has a pro-Brazilian or pro-South American government, despite the fact they're fascist. So they joined the war, and then the South American troops are pummeled into East Mexico, making a pretty good push. Nothing's really going on in South America. Over in Europe, recently we saw Poland, Crimea, and this country here end up joining the war against Russia. Well, over here, Kazakhstan is being heavily invaded. Now, before we move over to this part of Asia, we're going to go over to Africa, where the Orange Coast, as well as these two countries, have capitulated. Now, the Orange Coast called on these two countries to help, and then they all got boshed. And then this white line here shows this new Ghana country, which has been kind of set up. However, the war is still not over, so that's why it's a white border. As Ghana ended up rebelling from the Orange Coast, and America and her allies ended up saying that you can kind of get independence. Then over here, Egypt pulled up Pearl Harbor on America and took the Suez, and then have invaded Libya, doing quite well. However, West African troops are arriving on the front line, and I doubt this will stay this good for Egypt for that long. Then over here, we see that Russia has completely capitulated Caucasia, while also releasing an Azerbaijani country which joined their alliance. Again, white border, the war's not over. Then over here, they got this country to go ahead and join them for an invasion of Kazakhstan. And then also the Steppe Republic and Tanatuva joined to invade Kazakhstan. So Kazakhstan is getting killed on all sides. Then over here, we have some pretty interesting stuff happening. China wasn't as prepared for this, and they've been getting kind of pummeled down here. However, China has not lost a single major city. It's mainly South China that has lost 4. Well, up over here, Korea had a big offensive into China, but then they got split off as China was finally mobilized. And now Korean forces are stuck here with Chinese naval supremacy. Well, up here, this Primorsky country decided to join in on the war to kill Manchuria. Although now that China's here, they might not be around for much longer. And then over here, we see North Japan join the war and has launched an invasion of the Far East Republic. And then finally, in Oceania, Australia has decided to pull some World War II Japan stuff and has launched an invasion of the Indonesian countries, which kind of forced them to join the Red Team. And Australia has already capitulated New Guinea and Sulawesi and is pushing into the Sunda Federation. And the Strait of Malacca has fallen over to the Red Team, which was controlled by China. And I'm pretty sure that's it. I don't think there's anything else. But this is what the world map is looking like. But nonetheless, let's go ahead and get into the second part of World War V, also known as the War of the Elites. Over in the Americas, we see that the capital of West Mexico has finally fallen over to Red Team forces. They haven't somehow managed to get here. I don't know. Well, over here, America continues its spearhead towards California's coastline in order to cut the country in two. And we also see them manage to take this major city. Well, up here, America continues its offensive, mainly just launching an invasion of all the land. However, we see them make a brand new spearhead towards this major city here, which goes pretty well as they manage to kind of near it. While down here, Mexico continues to move. However, the advance is slowly halted as Mexico sends a lot of troops down here to prevent them from reaching the capital. However, over in the Yucatan, Brazilian and combined South American forces continue to beat back Mexico. Over in Africa, West African forces have arrived and have kicked back the Egyptians quite far, kicking them out of this populated area, taking back 3 major cities, and doing a bit of like encirclement stuff. We're also slightly kicking them back in the Sahara Desert. However, down south, Egypt has made some advances with its special desert forces. While over here, the whole of Estonia falls over to Red Team forces, as we see that they have undergone a naval landing up here. And also, I just realized, what are these random black lines on this map? Like, what is going on here? Okay, for some reason, the shadow is super messed up, but like, that's kind of whatever. It's not the end of the world. But anyway, all of Estonia falls over. Well, down here, Crimea continues its invasion of Russia. Now, I said this in the first part, but obviously that ended up breaking. Russia is quite stronger than everyone already thought, and this was mainly due to China massively funding them as their only European ally. So while Poland and Crimea should be able to technically defeat Russia on their own, both of them together and more is slowly killing Russia. However, it's not a quick, swift victory that it should be. However, by the capital, we actually see Russia make a pretty big pushback, picking them out of their country, as Russia actually begins their own invasion, which goes very well. I also just realized that I've been using different invasion colors this whole time. I was thinking that this color's too dark. Hold on. I also just realized that I've been using different invasion colors. Like, that's a light blue. This is more of a dark blue. Let me go in and turn all of that to light blue. But nonetheless, Russian troops continue their advance as they make a push for the Kazakhstani capital. However, they do not manage to take it. While over here, the State Republic and Tanatuva, as well as like Xinjiang, send in further troops as they prepare a spearhead towards the actually populated areas of Kazakhstan, which goes decently well. Well, down here, South China continues to lose land as the Red Team nears dangerously close to the main populated areas of South China. I mean, China itself is very populated. Like, what is this? This is absurd. I bet you there's more cities here than there is in the whole of Africa. But nonetheless, up here, this green country is fully kicked out as Far East forces, as well as Manchurian and Chinese forces, quickly push into the country, taking over quite a lot of their major cities and meeting up with the border of Korea. As they launch their full-scale invasion into Korea, the losses are heavy on this front line, and eventually a front line is established along this like narrow gap here, and these forces are finally encircled and defeated, which heavily weakens the Japanese countries and Korea, as they are kind of isolated over here. However, they are still holding out. In response to this, North Japan withdraws a lot of their forces over from here, not the whole world, leaving a lot of this land to go back over to the Far East Republic. However, they do hold a standpoint around this line. Nonetheless, down here, Australia manages to fully secure the island of Java, as they also launch an invasion for Borneo, heading for the Sunda Federation capital. However, Indian forces then arrive in the country, as we see Australia is pushed back very slightly. However, they do manage to hold a naval ground, and they even launch an invasion of southern Sumatra. But for now, the Sunda Federation holds on, strong, mighty, and a symbol of freedom. But nonetheless, this is what the world is looking like now. Over in North America, Red Team dominating. South America, Blue Team. Africa, Red Team. Europe, Red Team. Asia, it's mixed. So the Blue Team is not doing very well. However, China doesn't really have any more allies to go ahead and call on. Maybe Tibet and the Central Asian region, although I don't know the specific relationships with China and most countries. And I could imagine in the actual video that more African countries and more Central Asian countries do end up joining a side. However, I kind of doubt that any European country joins either side. Maybe people join the red side, but like, what's the point at that point? Like, these countries down here couldn't take on the red team in Europe, so it would kind of be a death sentence. I mean, Ireland would do pretty well, but against all of these combined, nah. Nonetheless, over here, we see the West Mexico is split in two, and eventually, after a swift campaign to take the rest of the Baja Peninsula, we see that West Mexico surrenders over to Allied forces. And this allows them to make a huge encirclement of Californian troops, which is a huge blow to California, as we swiftly see American troops combine into California, and they make a huge spearhead splitting the country in two, and this region falls. And for now, it's a pretty bloody campaign to take the rest of California, But America and East Mexico claim victory in North America. And this does allow Mexico to repurpose some troops to push back the South Americans. However, over here, the South Americans managed to take these two major cities and continue their advance over into the Yucatan. While down here, America managed to decisively defeat the Brazilian Navy, taking over Trinidad and Tobago, which is a huge loss for them because they can now use this as a naval grounding, as they can now use this as a naval base in order to invade South America. However, America is not strong enough for that yet. They still have troops in California, and they are sending troops all across the world. So America cannot take on Brazil and the whole of South America at the moment. But the South Americans are actually going to be doing something, and that is called using this war as an excuse to clean up the rest of the countries on your doorstep. Now, over in South America, the South American fascists are actually going to be doing something, and that is called dragging more countries into this war, or maybe on the third side, as we see the South American fascists go ahead and use this as a moment to eliminate their last opposition on the continent, which is the Rio Grande country and the Chilean country. Now, they don't attack Patagonia because Patagonia is basically just a fully neutral country. They're like the Switzerlands of this world. I mean, there still is a Switzerland, probably somewhere like that. But these are the Switzerland of South America as they stay neutral. However, South American fascist troops quickly move into Chile as they move down the coastline because that, like the Andean mountains, and they swiftly manage to take 3 major cities. While on the other side of the mountains, they also push in from Argentina. While over here, the Rio Grande country just gets folded immediately, leaving only their capital. And then this northern region falls over. Now, I know there's mountains here, but I'm just going to say it ends up surrendering. But nonetheless, that's it for South America. We'll have to see how that ends on the next round, which is quite obvious. Over here, we see Ghana officially decides to join the war. Now, previously, they peaced out. However, they decided to join America's side. Officially, this is kind of in response to Azerbaijan becoming a country and joining the war. But nonetheless, over here, Egypt is fully kicked out of Libya, as West Africa begins its invasion of Egypt, taking quite a lot of cities up here. Now, I didn't realize how weird this Egyptian capital place is. That is just desert. There's no way that's not just desert. Like, sure, there's a coastline, but it's something like that. And then, obviously, the Nile is, like, whatever. But, like, that is just desert. You can't tell me that's not desert. But anyway, where else are we going to? Up into Europe. Russia does continue to lose ground. As we see, I guess the historical city of St. Petersburg in this universe does end up falling. However, Russia holds a defensive front line. As they kind of begin a defensive hold around their capital, the capital of Russia is incredibly important to them and their history, and they will not lose this. Speaking of capitals, the Kazakhstani capital ends up falling over. And eventually, when Far East troops, and I guess like the Steppe Republic and Tanatuva, come in and take a few more major cities, we officially see Kazakhstan surrender over to Russian forces, if I can pick the right color. Kazakhstan is one of the first major countries to surrender. Now, are they a major country? Probably not. They're probably like a top 30 power. But they are one of the original like 3-point Star Alliance members. I mean, out of all the countries that have fallen, we've got these 3 here, which is like nothing. West Mexico, maybe. California is probably really the first major-ish country to fall. But second to that is probably Kazakhstan. But this is a huge win and a morale boost, as China can now officially easily move troops through to Russia. Or I say easily, it's going to take a while to get there, but like they have a land border now. Which means that Russia will soon be receiving troops from China, Far East Republic, Manchuria, Xinjiang, Tanatuva, and Steppe Republic. Imagine the troops invading Kazakhstan are just going to keep going into Russia in order to help them fight back. So Russia is heavily relieved by this. But nonetheless, over in Asia, things are still bad for South China as they continue to lose over to Indian and Vietnamese forces that managed to enter their superpopulated area and take over a lot of their major cities. Well, over here, India is pushed back by China as Chinese forces are basically just being thrown at India, which is a pretty effective move. Well, over here, China manages to break the Korean front line and push down into Korea, and a new front line is established down in the south. But this is a huge blow for America because Korea, if it falls, will be the strongest country to have fallen, as they have lost like half their population and their capital, which is a big blow. Well, over here, China has probably by now ran through this Primorsky country, which officially chooses to surrender over to Chinese forces like so. Nonetheless, down over in the Indonesian Isles, we see that Australia manages to make a huge breakthrough and actually managed to encircle the capital of the Sunda Federation and swiftly take over most of Borneo. But down here they continue their advance into Sumatra, as Red Australia is surprising America and their allies because they didn't think that they were that much of a threat. However, it turns out Australia is a threat, as even combined Indian and Vietnamese forces cannot hold back Australia. I mean, it's obvious that they're also spread down here, but it's still a pretty impressive feat for Australia to be winning this. But nonetheless, this is what the world is looking like on the second round of part 2. We can see North America has basically fallen and probably will be the next time. South America is doing its side quest. Africa, almost fully red. Europe, almost fully red. Asia, mixed. I'd actually kind of say that the blue team is actually winning in Asia. I mean, they have lost a lot of South Chinese cities, but they've also taken all of the northern part of but they've also taken North Korea and most of Indonesia, which I'd say outweigh like 5 Chinese cities. Oh, and they've also taken Kazakhstan and the Caucasus country, which could be considered Europe. Who knows? We see that California officially ends up falling over to America and they surrender. As this is a huge win for America's team, as they can now focus on pushing back the Central Americans. However, not yet, as the Central Americans have managed to take over the Yucatan Peninsula. The supplies and troops from Asia have allowed Russia to retake modern-day St. Petersburg. However, down over here, they continue to lose land to Crimea. As we also see Poland manage to take 2 more major cities. As the front line is slowly coming to a stop over here in Russia, no side can really beat the other right now. In order to take down Russia, they have to beat the supplies, which is like China and Asia, but they can't really do that, so they can't really take down Russia at the moment. But down here, China begins a huge liberation campaign and takes back most of South China. However, up in this region, we see Vietnam manage to make even more gains, taking back a lot more major cities. But down here, the capital of the Sunda Federation ends up falling, and eventually most of Sumatra falls, and we see the Sunda Federation officially surrenders over to Australia, which is a pretty big blow, as Australia is now directly on the border of Vietnam. And now they completely threaten the power balance over in Asia. Now, I don't know, would India and Vietnam do better against China? Because I just don't see how India and Vietnam would reach the Chinese core land. I mean, China is the strongest country in the world, and India is 4th, I guess, but Vietnam and Persia and southern India don't even make the, power rankings. So for now, it's mainly just a huge stalemate everywhere, but where it's not a stalemate is down in South America, as Chile has officially fallen over, while also the Rio Grande country has, and these 2 countries officially end up surrendering, which I'm pretty sure is this colour, which I guess is a win for the South American fascists, although, I mean, not really, because it's just kind of like, sure, you did that, but what did you get? Nothing. Which just leaves Patagonia looking very awkwardly, like, hello, what's going on? Please don't invade me. But the South American fascists don't really have any plans of invading Patagonia, because, I mean, what's the point? As they kind of agree that they can remain neutral. However, now that America is done with the Americas, Brazil may have to watch out for an invasion by America. Well, over in Africa, we see that Egypt has been pretty rolled, as all of the African allied forces have arrived, and they've managed to liberate the Suez Canal, and have managed to take most of the Egyptian land, and even pushing down here into the Sahara as they end up nearing the capital. And I think I've done every continent for this round. I kind of went all over the place, I'm not going to lie. But nonetheless, moving on to the next round, we see the Mexican forces manage to completely push out South American forces over to this front line here. However, the South Americans hold a very defensive front line, and Mexico and America cannot penetrate this. Well, over in Africa, Egypt's capital eventually falls over to Allied forces, as Egypt end up surrendering. Well, over here, Russia does manage to make some pushbacks against Allied forces. However, they are then pushed out of Crimea, if I can pick the right colour. And we see that this democratic country here ends up joining on the red team side, which is a huge blow for Russia, as they can launch invasions down here and even start a liberation campaign of Caucasia, which goes pretty well. As Caucasian rebels break out over in the major city, and we quickly see that Caucasia is re-established as a country, as Russia is swiftly forced to launch an invasion. As over in Europe, the front line is collapsing for the blue team. While down here, China continues to make gains, pushing back the Vietnamese away from South China. Over here, the Korean front line is yet again broken, and we see a huge blow for America as Korea ends up completely falling over to Chinese forces and surrenders. Now, a lot of the US Navy has arrived, which means Japan is fully protected from a naval invasion. However, the American Navy cannot be everywhere at once, and they don't know whether China plans to launch an invasion of the Malacca Strait in Vietnam from the south via Australia, or if they plan to invade Japan and wipe them out. However, up here, Far East troops has finally kicked North Japan out of here. And with the fall of Korea, North Japan orders the complete withdrawal of all forces up here, as they have to fully defend this land. Now, I will go ahead and give these 3 islands over to the Far East Republic, as I managed they could probably take them. But as we see more and more countries surrender, the war begins to pick up pace as more and more countries turn to conscription, as more and more people have died, as this is by far the deadliest war, as new advanced technology is killing way more people than before. Tens of millions have died, more than World War II, and the war isn't even done. And many countries over in the AN and across the world are calling for this to stop. The main countries that voice their concern are Mesopotamia, Arabia, and their surrounding friends, Greece, as well as Ireland, and also South Africa, as 3 of the Security Council members desperately call for this war to end. However, they are outnumbered 3 to 4, so that will not be happening. Now, while I'm editing this, I did realise that Tibet is a Security Council member, so the vote would be 4-4, but still that's a tie. And anyway, even if they won the vote, I doubt any members would actually agree to stop the war. So apologies on my behalf, but the story is kind of the same. But these countries do end up letting in refugees from the war, which earns them a lot of respect around the world. But nonetheless, I don't know where I was at. Am I starting a new round or what? I think I'm just going to start a new round. I can't even remember if I was mid-round, but I'm going to say I wasn't. And we're going over to here where nothing happens. However, America begins to put even more troops around and prepares for a naval invasion of Brazil. Well, over in Africa, nothing happens. Over in Russia, things get worse when Finland goes ahead and joins the war against Russia, and Russia didn't really defend this front. This leads to a huge collapse of troops up here. But down here, Caucasia is fully liberated, and Azerbaijan is wiped off the face of the earth. Well, over here, Russia is officially cut off from the Caspian Sea, as Russia is not doing too well, if I do say so myself. Over in South China, China manages to make some pretty big pushbacks against Vietnam and India. However, it's mainly a huge stalemate over here, as there are millions and millions and millions of troops along the border, constantly fighting each other, and neither side can really overpower the other. However, we see a huge naval battle take place over here, with the full might of the Australian Navy fights against Indian and Vietnam Navy, and also some of America's. And we actually see Australia comes out on top and manages to re-liberate the Strait of Malacca, as they instantly launch an invasion down here. However, this is quickly halted as Vietnamese troops begin pouring down here, which quickly leads to a big pushback, as the Australian Army is not stronger than the Indian and Vietnam Navy combined. But nonetheless, as the war goes on, the casualties are increasing and the calls for the end of the war are continuing. However, neither America nor China want an end to this war, as both believe that they can win in the long run. And that could be true for America, as they have just landed up in northern Brazil and have made a pretty big front line, which swiftly causes Brazil to withdraw all of its troops from Central America, which basically just collapses this front line. As Mexico begins an invasion of Central America, however, they do hold a defensive front line here. This invasion does go decently well, however, Brazil then sends its forces back and they manage to push them back quite a lot. However, America does manage to retreat. However, America does manage to retain some land here, which is a huge blow for the blue team, as America is now in South America, which I didn't think was possible. However, the American Navy is just on crack. And that's also kind of why the American Navy didn't win against the Australian Navy, is because most of them were preparing an invasion of Brazil. It is at this point in the war where we see all members not in the war that are in the AN are invited to a secret meeting led by Ireland, Greece, South Africa and Tibet, and these countries decide that something has to be done. Tens of millions are dead. There are millions and millions of refugees, diseases are broken out everywhere, famine and economic downturn have plagued countries, and millions are starving to death every day. And these countries decide that they need a symbol of democracy. They need a new world order that brings democracy and freedom to the world. And it's at this meeting where we see the creation of the Coalition of Democratic Nations, also known as the Liberators, is formed. Modelled under an ancient banner, we see these countries declare themselves a new front, the Coalition of Democratic Nations, aimed at eliminating all imperialism in the world. And this front will be marked by the colour purple and contains Mesopotamia, Arabia, South Africa, Ireland, Greece, and Tibet. But that is not it, as we quickly see these countries, which are heavily aligned to Mesopotamia and Arabia, swiftly join this democratic pact. Now, all of these countries are democracies and wish to rebring democracy to the world. I'm pretty sure they all are. And these countries join this new alliance here, especially these full democracies. As we see, a new front line opens up in the Middle East. But this is not the only place. We swiftly see that all of South Africa's alliance, which are these 4 countries, end up joining this war. And we also see that the full democracies of Africa agree to join the Coalition of Democratic Nations, which includes Madagascar, which I don't think is going to do much. We also see countries like the South Congo and Tanzania. And quite notably, Ethiopia, which got absolutely destroyed in the last World War. However, they know that the consequences are dire. However, the situation is dire and they must stop this. And just because they're purple, we also see Angola join, because otherwise they're just kind of sat there as like an outlier. And it's at this point where we see the rest of Africa, all the democracies of Africa, also join the Liberators, as we see a brand new front line has opened up in Africa. Now, we also see Patagonia join this. However, I'm assuming they're going to get obliterated off the face of the earth, so rest in peace, Patagonia, I guess. Over in Europe, we see this like southern Romanian country join. However, we do not see any other European countries join this alliance, but we do see Iceland's entrance. Over in Asia, we see these Central Asian democracies also join the Liberators, leaving just this tiny Aral country as the only neutral country here, so I will go ahead and colour them a different colour. Like, just look at that. So much purple, red, and blue, and then you just have this like tiny Aral country. But finally in Asia, we see the Philippines, this Panay country, and this Mindanao country. I said that so wrong, I'm sorry, join. And we officially see that every single country in Asia is now on the side of this war, except the Aral country. And somehow, Europe is the most peaceful continent, which, honestly, how has that happened? And the final countries to join are going to make some of the biggest difference. And that is actually going to be the Unitarian Federation, which vows to restore democracy to America, as they are joined by Alaska, as well as New Holland, which are all pure democracies, as a brand new huge front line has opened in the Americas. And this is what the war is looking like now. But you're going to have to wait till the next part to see how this war turns out, as we've run out of time, unfortunately. But I hope you enjoyed this part, and I hope you enjoyed the ending, and I'll see you in the next one. Have a great day.